From high atop the city of Philadelphia on the 52nd floor of the Mellon Bank Center and the Content Club studio in the Pyramid Club of Philadelphia, this is Storytelling with a Purpose. I'm your host, Jim DiLorenzo, and I am pleased to welcome my guest, award-winning journalist, author, and documentary filmmaker, Jennifer Lin. On this episode, we will discuss storytelling as it relates to how Jennifer developed an interest in the story of the Philadelphia Orchestra's historic 1973 tour of the People's Republic of China. For 31 years, Jennifer worked at the Philadelphia Inquirer as a reporter, including posts as a foreign correspondent in China, a financial correspondent on Wall Street, and a national correspondent in Washington, D.C. She is also the author of a family memoir, Shanghai Faithful, Betrayal and Forgiveness in a Chinese Christian Family, and co-author of Soul Sisters, Stories of Women and Running. Jennifer, I want you to know how much I enjoyed the book. I've read it twice in the last month or so, and I had read it once before last year. And I'm enthralled with the story that you told. And I highlighted some portions, and I might refer back to them during our conversation. But I wanted to begin our conversation today with the role storytelling has played in your career. We've had a little discussion pre-show about that, but can you share with me and our audience some of the ways that storytelling has been a major part of your career?
Well, Jim, first of all, thank you for inviting me on your show and for giving me the opportunity to talk about this. I love talking about storytelling. So I have spent most of my professional life as a reporter, and always as a reporter, never as an editor, because reporters had all the fun. And so at the Inquirer, I did a lot of different type of reporting. I was based in China and New York and Washington, but I really enjoyed doing kind of in-depth stories. And a paper like the Inquirer, I had the luxury, the privilege really of being able to tell longer stories. So, but after 31 years at the paper, I really wanted to try my hand at different types of storytelling. So I left the Inquirer in 2015 in order to try writing a family memoir, in order to try making documentaries and really exploring more storytelling in different formats. So I've been doing that since then, and I've written 2 books and made 1 documentary, and I'm working on 2 others. So it's been thrilling.
And that's an amazing thing when you describe it as, I wanted to find other ways of telling stories. And I think you were a bit ahead of the curve at that point, because the newspaper business was still transitioning into a new phase in 2015. For the book on Beethoven in Beijing, and for the documentary, what role did finding that story play? Did you start working on that story while you were at the Inquirer? Because I know there was an anniversary of the tour, the Philadelphia Orchestra tour. Or what kind of spurred the moment wherein you said, "Oh, this is a story that"?
Yeah. So the movie came first, Beethoven in Beijing, and then I wrote the book. And it was really a confluence of things. I was at a stage in my career where I wanted to try other types of storytelling, and I always wanted to try my hand at documentary filmmaking. My son is a film editor, and I like to tell people that, I wanted to grow up to be like my son. And when I was thinking about what story would I want to tell, I just, kind of really was drawn to the Philadelphia Orchestra's China legacy. And the spark for that really came from an assignment I was given in 2008.
Okay.
So I worked in China in the 1990s. In 2008, I was back in Philly. I was working for the news desk, and the Philadelphia Orchestra was going to China on tour. They did that many times. In fact, they've been to China more than any American orchestra. So in 2008, it was the 35th anniversary of this 1973 tour. And they were making a big deal about it. The Chinese hosts were making a big deal about it. And luckily for me, the music critic couldn't make the trip.
Okay.
So my editor, knowing that I had worked in China, said, "Would you like to go?" And it's like, yeah. And so I went, and it was a busy time in China. There was a lot going on that I was reporting on. The Olympics were about ready to start. There was, an earthquake in Sichuan, which I covered when I was there. But I also was writing about this Philadelphia Orchestra concert in Beijing, 2008, to mark the 35th anniversary of this historic tour. So what struck me is, given the fact that I had lived in China, worked in China, I was really amazed when I covered this concert at the impact that the Philadelphia Orchestra had on the Chinese people. There was such genuine nostalgia and warm feelings towards the Philadelphia Orchestra. So, like any reporter, I'm not a classical music critic, so I didn't write about the music. I wrote about the event, and I interviewed people going in and out of the concert hall. And just to a person, everyone had just like warm memories of this tour in 1973, and it had such a lingering impact. And I thought, in the back of my head, this is really interesting. So when I left the Inquirer, I seized upon this as the first documentary to pitch, because it combined like two interests of mine. Sure. I have a long history and interest in China. My father immigrated from Shanghai, so I've always been interested in China, and I'm from Philadelphia. So to me, a documentary about the Philadelphia Orchestra's history and legacy in China was a great way of combining these two interests of mine. So in 2015, I pitched the orchestra the idea of doing a documentary, reminding them that in this year, 2023, they would be celebrating the 50th anniversary of that big event. And so in 2015, the orchestra's like, wow, that's like so many years from now, but it's a good thing I pitched it then.
Yeah.
They said to me, we like your idea. Have you ever done a documentary? And I said, no. And so they introduced me to Sam Katz. Now, Sam Katz is probably a familiar name to many Philadelphians. He had a prior career in finance and politics, but at that time, Sam had also made a career pivot into documentary filmmaking. So I met Sam, I pitched him the idea. He joined me and ended up producing the film with me, and we worked together. It took us 6 years to make this film.
Wow.
So it's a good thing I pitched them back in 2015, because it took a long time. We had our premiere on PBS's Great Performances in 2021, and this year is the 50th anniversary. So we're having a special community screening, a free screening on September the 7th.
Okay.
It's been a long journey.
And it is, as you said, you took the leap in 2015 and said, I'm going to do this documentary, went to the orchestra. Have you ever done one before? And I think that's so compelling.
Chutzpah.
And it's chutzpah. It's brave. It's daring, and it's also kind of a nice entrepreneurial leap of faith, if you will. That I'm going to do this thing that I've never done before, and I'm going to do it on this big subject.
Yeah.
And I'm going to pull it off. And as you said, it took time, but it turned out to be a really, really interesting and fun and moving piece, both to the documentary and then, as you described it earlier today, your pandemic book.
Yeah.
Which.
Well, had I known back in 2015 how hard it was going to be to make a documentary, a full-length documentary, I'm not sure I would have taken that leap. But it's been a great learning experience. So.
And you're doing other documentaries now. After that, you told me about one that you're working on, a mini documentary, as you described it.
Yes.
Called 10 Times Better. Could you, just in passing, could you tell us a little bit about the story of that upcoming project?
I have two documentary projects in the works. They're both about ballet. And the one that you mentioned is 10 Times Better. I hope to finish that this year and get that into the world. And I'll just give you the elevator pitch here, Jim. But 10 Times Better is about an 88-year-old Chinese-American blackjack dealer in Las Vegas who has an amazing place in ballet history. So George Lee originated the Chinese role in George Balanchine's The Nutcracker and was also in the original cast of Flower Drum Song. So he is a pioneer. He is to dance what James Hong, the actor, is to movies. So I hope to, get the George Lee story out there.
That's wonderful. And he's still dealing blackjack.
5 days a week.
And you've said he's done that for the last 40 some
40
years?
years. And before that, he was a dancer who got his training in Shanghai.
Wow. That's an amazing story. And when you came up with the idea for the story of the Philadelphia Orchestra's 1973 tour in China, and then you're now working on this George Lee documentary, and you're working on another documentary about ballet. How do you find that story idea? Where do you find that peg that says, I'm going to do something with this story? Like, how do you discover that? We talked a little about this before, but how did you make that leap to, oh, this is a story I want to do. This is a story I want to tell?
So with Beethoven in Beijing, the impetus for that was the fact that I knew this anniversary was coming. And I just saw this as not only a rich story, but also a visually interesting story. And I thought a story about the Philadelphia Orchestra is a story that should be seen and heard, mm-hmm. and not just read about. But I filled in the read about later when I wrote the book.
Sure.
But in terms of the documentary, it just had so many elements. It had gorgeous music. It had history. So there were a lot of archival assets that I was able to find and then use to build this story. So the spark, again, Beethoven in Beijing, it wasn't something that just overnight. It was just an idea that was germinating in my head. Sure. Since that assignment, as I mentioned, in 2008. So when I left the newspaper and I was looking for that next big thing to do, I actually had two projects. One was launching and pitching Beethoven in Beijing, but the other was writing a family memoir, right? Shanghai Faithful. And in that case, that was a story that I had been working on for literally 40 years. So, wow. So the spark for that, I mean, when we talk about inspiration, what is the inspiration for a story? My father immigrated from Shanghai in 1949. 1979, he took me and two of my sisters back to Shanghai to meet the family he left behind. And so, my dad hadn't seen his family in 30 years. And the first night we were there, an uncle of his pulled him aside and said to him, "Do you have any idea what happened to us these last 30 years?" And the truth of the matter is my father didn't know, because China was closed. I mean, the thing about Beethoven in Beijing and my family memoir, the thing you need to keep in mind is from 1949 until Nixon went to China in 72, we didn't have any sort of relationship with China. There was no travel, there was no diplomatic relations, no business, nothing. They were sealed off from us. So it was only in the 70s that things began to change. So when my father took us to China, and it was this happy family reunion, and then this uncle pulled us aside and said, "Do you have any idea how hard it's been for us?" And we didn't. So the impetus really for my family memoir began on that summer night in Shanghai in 1979, wow. when we learned how hard it had been for the family and kind of the persecution they had to endure for so many years. So for that, it was a story. Well, let's put it this way. At first I thought, wow, there's an interesting article to write here. So I wrote an article. Then I thought there's an interesting magazine piece. And I wrote a magazine piece about my family. So finally, after decades and decades of mining the family history, I thought there's a book here.
Sure.
So, one reason I left the paper is I wanted to finish my family memoir, which I did in 2017.
That's a great starting point, an origin story, if you will, mm-hmm. for that, and for your current projects. I often compare it when I'm dealing with my clients and my prospective clients and my colleagues and my friends. I pretend I'm an investigative reporter, and I'll ask questions that I think will help me find the nugget of the story, or several nuggets of a story. And I mentioned to you earlier, I try to embed myself with my clients so that I can see things that they might not realize would be a good story, or I might find something that can be a good tactic that they can use, or something that they could work with, or enhance, or expand. And I like to wear that investigative reporter hat. I joke about being a private investigator who's in public relations. And it's that curiosity, it's that wanting to know more. And I think that that's a great part of what you do in your storytelling. And the other thing that I liked about your story in particular is you made that conscious decision. There's got to be other ways I can tell these stories. I want to find other media. I want to find other platforms. I want to find. Now we're all big on content creation, but that basically is the same thing as storytelling. You know, we're creating these moments that connect with people. And I think what you're working on over these last few years is certainly an example of that.
So what I'm doing now is really just a different type of reporting.
Yeah.
But at the heart, everything I'm doing is basic reporting. So let's start with Beethoven in Beijing, the film. I mean, for that, the reporting started with finding these musicians, finding these people who had been to China in 1973
Sure.
and trying to get their oral histories recorded. So I began that process in 2015. And then, you know, I love reporting. I mean, it's the reason I did it my whole life. And so with Beethoven in Beijing, in order to build the story, I then kind of immersed myself in archives. And some of my favorite discoveries were in archives, particularly I think my best find was at the Nixon Library. So Richard, just a little bit of history here. Richard Nixon began the process of opening up China in 1972 when he traveled to China and met Mao, and that was historic. That began this process. And then he wanted to keep things going. And Nixon and his team and Kissinger, they wanted to add kind of a cultural element to the relationship. Sure. And he asked his favorite musician, his favorite conductor, Eugene Ormandy, to be the first American orchestra to go to China. And what I discovered in my research is, I'm looking at all the old clips about the tour at Temple University. They have the urban archives there, all of the clips from the Bulletin and the Inquirer. And I'm going through all these clips. And I was like, gee, I wonder, when did Nixon invite Ormandy? So I found that story in the Bulletin. It was February of 1973. And then I was on the website for the Nixon Library. Now, Nixon, if you'll recall, he had a habit of recording all of his Oval Office conversations.
I've heard something about that.
And because of an act of Congress, all those had to be made public. So I went on the library's, index under all the recordings from the Oval Office, and I went to February 1973, seeing if I could find anything.
Sure.
And lo and behold, there was an entry saying Ormandy. So I clicked on this digital file, and it was a pristine audio recording of Nixon on the phone with Eugene Ormandy, inviting. He called it the Philadelphia Symphony. It's not. It's the Philadelphia Orchestra, but we'll forgive Nixon for that. But he called up Ormandy and invited him to go to China, and he said, "Henry is sitting right here with me. Eugene, we'd like for you to take your musicians to China." So
that's wild.
It's it's research and discovery like that just really excites me. Yeah. So there was a lot of that in both the film and the book. I mean, the book was, as I mentioned to you before, that was my COVID project. So we finished the film. In parlance, we locked it on March the 1st, 2020. Of course. And I had planned on going to like a dozen film festivals that we had gotten into. Sam was organizing a big premiere. We thought we'd have it at the Academy of Music.
Sure.
Of course, none of that happened. All of the film festivals were virtual, and suddenly I'm in my attic with nothing to do. So, trying to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear or lemonade out of a lemon, I thought, I have all of this research for the movie that didn't get into the movie. I think I'll try writing a book. But I made the conscious decision, the creative decision, to tell this story as oral history.
Sure.
Because I wanted the people who lived the experience to be the ones to tell the experience. So not only did I have interviews, but I also found incredible archival material. Some families lent me journals that their relatives had written. There was a diplomat who was part of the tour, Nick Platt, and he gave me the journal that his late wife had written. There was a piccolo player, and their family gave me his journal that I could tap in order to construct a story.
Sure.
In order to construct what this tour was like, what did they see, what was the impact, and I found some sources in unlikely places.
Like what?
Well, I would make a habit like once a week of just Googling Philadelphia Orchestra in China in 1973. And one week when I was doing that, up popped this entry from WikiLeaks.
Oh, that's right.
And Julian Assange had put up on WikiLeaks all of these unclassified cables. So again, an important thing to remember about this 1973 tour is it wasn't just about music.
Right.
It wasn't just about being the first American orchestra in China. It was about geopolitics. There was a bigger game that was being played here. And the Philadelphia Orchestra was part of that. There was a real effort to kind of change perceptions in China of Americans because we had like 24 years of just of Cold War era type of isolation. So the orchestra was part of a charm offensive to win over the Chinese. And what I discovered in WikiLeaks were all of these diplomatic cables.
Wow.
Being sent by our diplomats on the ground in Beijing. We had an office, we didn't have an embassy, but they were writing to their colleagues at the State Department. So through all these cables, you see what high-level attention this tour was getting.
I think it's interesting in the book, in particular, you mentioned the great attention to Madame Mao's persona, what she was wearing,
Right.
what she was, how she reacted to things, and she being kind of the barometer for how it was going, and what could we expect from China in the future. Mao Zedong's wife was basically the cultural minister, if you will, at the time, and how she was reacting to the orchestra at each stop along the way and the things that she said and did. And that's the stuff that you found in WikiLeaks.
Yeah, I mean, this was real diplomatic reading of the tea leaves here. They were looking for any signal, any sign that would kind of give them an idea of where things were going. Again, 1972, Nixon goes to China. 1973, the orchestra arrives in China. We still didn't know. Nixon and Kissinger still didn't know where things were going with
Sure.
the relationship with China. Like they were being warm and friendly now, but would that continue? So they were looking for signs. And it's, as you mentioned, like everything was being studied and deconstructed. Like so Madame Mao was the wife of Chairman Mao. Her name was Jiang Qing. And she was a very important political figure. And basically she wanted to be in control also. And she was up against the premier of China, which was Zhou Enlai. So there was a lot of behind-the-scenes tension. So it was very interesting because Madame Mao decided to go to the concert one night. The orchestra didn't know until that day that she would be attending. And so Nick Platt, who was the American diplomat on the ground, and he was basically the person in charge of the Philadelphia Orchestra's visit, he wrote back to the State Department in Washington describing the event and describing what she was wearing, the fact that Madame Mao didn't have on a Mao suit, she had on a dress and she carried a purse and she had a wristwatch on that had semi-precious stones around it. So they were looking for signs. And the other thing that happened in these cables is at the end of the tour, the person who was in charge of the U.S. mission in China wrote back to the Home Office saying this was a huge success. So you could see in these cables kind of the degree of importance of this trip beyond just the music,
Sure.
the geopolitics of the moment.
And it's amazing because that's something, as you have mentioned, it's kind of been lost to history as far as how important this was. There's a line in the book, a headline on the Philadelphia Inquirer. After 25 years, Americans are welcome in China. And then you quote, a correspondent for the Associated Press swooned, the spring-like warmth in U.S.-China contacts at the human level cannot fail to melt some of the ice that has congealed in a long winter of hostility. And I think that's amazing when you think about it, because even today we have some needs to bridge our differences, But at that particular time, for the Nixon administration, our State Department, and even the Chinese officials to see that this using the Philadelphia Orchestra to bridge that gap, to bring people together, was an amazing diplomatic effort.
You know, one of the stories that I read, and I think I used this in the book, mentioned how at the time that the Philadelphia Orchestra arrived in China, they had a charter jet. There were 130 people on this jet. They arrived in Beijing September 12th, 1973. At that particular time, there were fewer than 100 Americans living in China.
Wow.
Now think about that.
Wow.
And then all of a sudden, this great orchestra appears, and they're out on the street, and they're always attracting attention.
Yeah.
So it was big news. The People's Daily, which is like the main mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party, on the front page, they ran a photo of the entire entourage from Philadelphia and wrote a story. And one of the musicians, Tony Orlando, who was a percussionist, he said, we really did feel like we were diplomats. And Ormandy understood the import of the tour, too, because at the end of the tour, he said that this was about more than music.
Yeah.
And, back to, the sources that I used for the oral history, one of the resources I mined were the news reports. So there were 4 journalists who traveled with the Philadelphia Orchestra.
And they were kind of innovative choices.
Yes. So one was obvious. Harold Schoenberg, who was the New York Times classical music critic, he went. Daniel Webster from the Philadelphia Inquirer, who covered the orchestra, he went. They sent a young 20-something reporter from WCAU, Kati Martin, who was fresh out of graduate school, and a cub reporter getting the plum assignment of all plum assignments. And of course, the older guys at the TV station had their daggers out for her because they were jealous.
Sure.
She was 25, I think. But then the 4th pick in this media entourage
This is my favorite.
Was brilliant. The Philadelphia Bulletin sent Sandy Grady, who was a sports columnist, and he was a wonderful writer. He was also like every man. So the Times and the Inquirer sent classical music experts, but the Bulletin, deciding to zig when everyone was zagging, just sent their sports columnists. So he enters China with like fresh eyes and an admittedly unsophisticated view of classical music, and he was the perfect person.
Yeah.
And his descriptions of what happened and reactions to concerts, I include a lot of them in the oral history because they're so good.
There are some great parts in there. I love the part where they're playing Frisbee.
Yes.
And all the kids are gathering around, and all of a sudden there's 300 kids.
Yeah.
Descending on them, wanting to be in the Frisbee, playing Frisbee with the orchestra members.
Yes.
And the story about the member of the orchestra who gave out his reeds.
Yes.
To people he gave all of his reeds to one man, and he was passing them along to others, and he still had the one reed when they catch up with him later.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite stories from both the book and the film. So there were opportunities where the Philadelphia musicians could meet their counterparts. And there was one day where they had a closed-door rehearsal of the Central Philharmonic. I say closed door because remember, 1973, Chinese musicians were not allowed to perform Western classical music. It was during the Cultural Revolution, and that was banned. The only thing these trained musicians could perform were revolutionary pieces, like The White-Haired Girl or The Red Detachment of Women.
Right, and the Yellow River Concerto.
Yellow River Concerto, which is still played today. But anyway, so they went to this rehearsal of the Central Phil because the Chinese musicians wanted to show the Americans how they could perform. So behind closed doors, they performed Beethoven's Fifth. And at one point, the conductor turned to Ormandy and said, "You come and conduct us." So Ormandy took off his coat and started conducting them. And musicians said that they could immediately see the difference and that the music improved so much. After this rehearsal, then the musicians got to meet each other and exchange gifts. And there was a famous oboe player for the Philadelphia Orchestra who gave his counterpart just a box of reeds, which would, to him was just a small token.
Sure.
But to the Chinese musician, this was a big deal because the reeds were hard to get. And this man, I actually met him and interviewed him in 2016, and he had saved a reed all those years.
Wow.
And brought it with him to this reunion that we had. So when we were filming the movie in 2016, we had a luncheon where we brought the Philadelphia musicians who had been in China in 73 together with some of their Chinese counterparts. And this man's wife was a violinist. And I'll never forget this moment because we caught it on film, thankfully. But as soon as the Chinese musicians entered this restaurant where we were having a reunion, this woman, this violinist, ran up to Booker Rowe, who is a violinist with the Philadelphia Orchestra, and said, "You're the one. You're the one who in 1973 gave me music." So again, it was a small gesture on Booker's part. He couldn't even remember. But to this woman, the fact that someone gave her sheet music was a huge deal. Again, Cultural Revolution was a chaotic time.
Right.
And classical musicians weren't allowed to perform Western music, but they also, a lot of them had their sheet music destroyed by Red Guards during this very violent, chaotic period. So this woman didn't have any sheet music, and Booker gave her the Mendelssohn string quartets, and she treasured that. So the next year when we went back to film, I actually went to their apartment, and she pulled off of her shelf this music that Booker had given her in 1973.
Wow.
That night, we took them to the orchestra to see the Philadelphia Orchestra perform Beethoven's Ninth with a Chinese choir. And it was just a remarkable moment. And she got to say hello to Booker again. So the film and the book are filled with little stories.
Sure.
Because it's the little stories that create the bigger story.
I think that's one of the great things about your storytelling here and storytelling overall is when you find those nuggets, you find those little gems, and you can craft a story and incorporate that into your work.
Mm-hmm.
One of the stories that has a through line for me in the book is the story of Eugene Ormandy, the conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra, and his role in this diplomatic and cultural approach to China. But one of the things that struck me funny all the way along the way was how everybody would say, "Well, he won't do that," or "He doesn't do that. He never will do that. He doesn't want to play Beethoven's Sixth. He doesn't want to do. Doesn't want to have dinner outside of the hotel room. His wife cooks chicken or steak for him in the room wherever he goes, or he won't do this. He won't do that." And what I found fascinating and touching and humorous about it is every step along the way, he kind of says, "Okay, I'll do it."
Ormandy was a diva with a capital D. He was also incredibly savvy when it came to politics. He lobbied to go to China. It just didn't fall out of the sky. He was working every channel he could. And Nixon loved Ormandy. It was his favorite orchestra when he was a boy growing up. He listened to the Philadelphia Orchestra albums. But Ormandy, again, everything you said is true. He never would do any touring like a tourist when he was on the road, like when they would go to Europe.
Sure.
He would eat in his room. His poor wife, Gretel, had to make him chicken, in his room every night. He wouldn't go out to eat. But it was Nick Platt, primarily, the diplomat on the ground, who convinced him that basically U.S.-China relations would be held in balance unless Ormandy would do some of these things like attend banquets, like be a tourist and go walk on the Great Wall. So he actually capitulated and did whatever they asked him to do.
And it sounded like, in the way it's described in your book and some of the things you see in the documentary, it looks like he was enjoying himself.
He was.
Yeah,
he was at the center of attention.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, so for a diva, there was no better place to be. And the world had its eyes on him.
That's amazing. There's another story that kind of weaves its way through the book, and Tan Dun, the musician and the conductor and the composer, I found it fascinating. Would you mind kind of encapsulating some of what you learned about Tan Dun?
So Tan Dun is one of the most famous composers in China today, and a lot of people would be familiar with him because he did the score for Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and actually won an Oscar and a Grammy for that music that he did. But Tan Dun was one of the first people I interviewed for the movie, and he's such a compelling person. He's one of those people who you want to watch on the screen.
Okay.
And he told an amazing story about being a teenager in 1973. He was working on a commune in Hunan province, and he just heard over the loudspeaker the news of the day. Now, back then, ordinary Chinese didn't have radios and TVs. They would get their news from these loudspeakers that would announce just, in the morning and in the evening what was happening. And there was this report about the Philadelphia Orchestra was in town. And he just heard snippets of Beethoven, not the whole thing, just a little snippet. And he had never heard music like that. And it just left such an indelible mark in his memory. And it had such an impact on him. So Tan Dun became a composer. In 1979, he went when conservatories and universities reopened because they had been shut during the Cultural Revolution. But when it became okay to study once again classical music, he was at the conservatory and ended up then coming to the United States to study at Columbia and becoming a composer. And the really remarkable thing about the Tan Dun story is he was this teenager who heard the orchestra back in 73. And then in 2014, he was a famous composer, and the Philadelphia Orchestra premiered his masterpiece, Nushu, not only in Philadelphia, but they took it on the road. They took it to China.
Wow.
And it premiered in Beijing. And then the orchestra went to his home province of Hunan and performed his piece in his hometown. And, Tan Dun in the book and also in the film talks about this moment as being just such a high point of his life, to have this orchestra performing his music in his hometown. So It's kind of a story that brings the film kind of full circle.
Sure. I just had this picture in my mind of him working in the field, a teenage boy working in a field and having this loudspeaker.
Yeah.
And he's like,
what is that?
What is that?
Yeah.
And now here he is, all these years later, a major figure in classical and music and music at large.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people in China who became well-known musicians, well-known composers, and a lot of them point to that 1973 visit by the Philadelphia Orchestra as the turning point in China culturally. Could you talk a little bit about what the legacy of the 73 tour is for those musicians like Long Long? And
so musicians like Tan Dun remembers when they were there. He wasn't at any of the concert, but he remembers the moment. For subsequent generations of Chinese people, they also remember the legacy of the Philadelphia Orchestra. And it's very interesting because there's a tight connection between Philadelphia and Chinese musicians. And in fact, three of arguably the top pianists, young Chinese pianists today, all did their training at the Curtis Institute, all with one professor, Gary Grafman. And so that would be Lang Lang, Yu Jia Wang, and Zhang Haoqian. All three of those pianists, who, again, are superstars, they all studied at Curtis, and they all studied with Gary Grafman. And Lang Lang, in particular, tells a story about being a boy. I think he was 10 years old in 1993 when the orchestra came back to China, and he was a student at the Central Conservatory and got a ticket and attended this concert of the Philadelphia Orchestra at the Great Hall of the People. And he remembers that concert vividly.
Wow.
That when he came then to Philadelphia to study at Curtis as a teen, he said every Saturday he was at the Academy of Music to hear the orchestra. So he later then was invited by the orchestra in 2001 to go with them on tour. And it was his professional debut in China, and they were performing at the Great Hall of the People. So Lang Lang, talks about how important that was for him to make his professional debut in China with the Philadelphia Orchestra. And the funny story there is the promoters of this concert had said to the Philadelphia Orchestra, "Can't you bring someone else, someone who's won some contests in the United States?" And the orchestra said, "No, it's going to be Lang Lang, and it's only going to be Lang Lang, or else we're not going." So
That's amazing.
yeah, so Lang Lang, I think, has performed with the orchestra more than 20 times since then.
That's an amazing legacy, if you will. What we've talked about the film, we've talked about the book. The book is available Amazon.com, Barnes and Noble, other online and physical bookstores. It's a great book, well worth your time. Beautiful illustrations and photos, Beethoven in Beijing. And what has been the reaction that you've gotten from people who've read the book or have seen the documentary? What are some of the reactions that people have for you about the story?
It's been really positive, and that's been encouraging. For a lot of people, it's a new story. It's one they didn't know. For people who remember the tour, especially Chinese people, it's been very warmly received. And I'm happy to report that I'll be traveling to China in November to do screenings in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Hong Kong.
Wow.
So the embassy is setting that up for me. So
That's fantastic.
Yeah, and so it's been well received.
Wow, that's going to be exciting too,
Yes.
to get their reactions.
Mm-hmm.
Will the people who appear in the film, will they be able to attend some of the screenings? Do you
Hopefully,
think?
yeah. Especially in Beijing, hopefully.
Sure.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned 10 Times Better, and the other film is the
My second documentary I'm working on, it's in production, is Beyond Yellowface. So it's about two ballet dancers who are trying to rid ballet of racial stereotypes.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm looking forward to those, because if it's anything like this, I especially want to see George Lee's story. That's an amazing story.
That's going to be, stay tuned for that one.
Yeah.
I'm really excited about that.
And when you find these stories, is there one, like when you were working on this book and you were working on the film, was you mentioned the Nixon Library and the Ormandy phone conversation. Were there other eureka moments or like, oh my God moments that along the way that kind of like helped you keep going?
There were many, yeah. And Library of Congress, I found a lot of gems there. I found this wonderful recording of a press conference that Ormandy gave at the National Press Club, which was pristine.
Oh my gosh.
But you know, the Nixon Library one has to be at the top of the list. But then there were many nuggets of gold that I found along the way. The WikiLeaks one was pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And some of the personal journals too.
That's amazing. I mean, and again, it's investigative reporting.
Mm-hmm.
It's discipline. It's diligence. It's perseverance. It's an amazing process, and I think the storytelling often goes overlooked in these days of we're going to create content.
Yes.
You know, and what is content really when you think about it? It's a story.
It's all about the story.
Right. That never goes away.
No, I mean, you need a compelling story to get attention, and I think, you know, that's the key to everything. It's, as you just said, it's more than just clicks. It's content. It's story. Tell me a story.
Exactly. Well, Jennifer, I really want to thank you for being my guest today. I encourage our listeners and viewers to check out your film, which is on the PBS website in the Great Performances section, and there's going to be a screening here in Philadelphia on September 7th at the Pennsylvania Convention Center. There's an Eventbrite page for that if you want to register for a free ticket. The book, Beethoven in Beijing, published by Temple University Press, is available at most major booksellers, as I mentioned, including online at Barnes & Noble and Amazon.com. And again, before we close out today's episode, let me reiterate that my goal in each episode of Storytelling with a Purpose is to share conversations that enlighten you to how storytelling works, what goes into it, and how it can move the listener, the viewer, or the reader to some action. Storytelling to me, with a purpose to me, is how I work with my clients, my colleagues, my friends, to bring to light stories that can connect with an intended audience in a purposeful way, making an emotional connection and capturing heart share that leads to mind share. I started telling stories while I was still in high school, and I found that public relations is my true vocation. Other people become priests. Other people become ministers. Mine is storytelling, as is Jennifer's. I encourage you to reach out to me if you have any questions about our show today or any other questions, would like to tell me a story, or if you have a story that I can tell you. Please feel free to contact me directly either by cell phone at 215-266-5943 or by email at jim@jhdenterprises.com. I'm also available on social media, including X, formerly known as Twitter, at JHD16, on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, as well as my website, jhdenterprises.com. Jennifer, thank you again so much for sharing this time with me and our listeners and viewers. And I wish you a successful tour in November in China.
Thank you, Jim, for letting me tell my story.